Operation Barbarossa was Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in World War II. It started in June of 1941 and opened Germany's Eastern Front with the largest military invasion in history, spanning across a nearly 1,800-mile front. Hitler had multiple motivations for invading the Soviet Union. He deemed it as a possible means of forcing the British to surrender, but ultimately, it was a war against the Bolshevik ideology of the Soviet Union and a means of achieving Lebensraum, or living space for his future German Empire. These points are all deeply tied to the Nazis' practical need for expansion, as well as their twisted racial motivations. While the idea of a British surrender was much less significant in comparison to Lebensraum or the War of Ideologies, it is worth noting. In late 1940, Hitler assumed that Britain was nearing defeat. Germany had conquered France and forced British armies to retreat out of continental Europe and back to their homeland. At this point, Hitler considered that one of Britain's only chances of victory was through an alliance with the United States or the Soviet Union. He figured that if Germany defeated the Soviets, then Britain would lose its last potential continental ally, leaving them with little choice but to surrender. While Hitler was much more focused on different motives for the war in the East, it holds some significance, as this reasoning may have done well to ease the minds of his army's high command, who were initially hesitant at the idea of opening a second front in Europe, which was a significant issue for the German army in World War I. A possible British surrender could also end their ongoing blockade meant to impede German access to vital supplies. This made it a much more tactical and practical excuse for such a bold idea, which was only conflated by the encroaching Soviet forces in the East. At the time of conceiving Operation Barbarossa in mid to late 1940, the Soviets and the Nazis had a non-aggression pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after their respective diplomats. While this pact quelled hostilities between the nations, Hitler deemed it as a pact of convenience that was only meant to buy time for the Nazis. When the Soviets began to quickly expand west into territories between Germany and Russia, it raised concerns, especially when the Soviets were nearing Romania and the oil fields there that Germany was interested in. This initiated the first operational studies of a potential conflict with the Soviets. The Nazis were already importing key resources from the Soviet Union such as oil and food and were seeking to acquire assets of their own to become less reliant on those imports. While resources and war tactics were very relevant issues for Germany at the time, the main motives for Hitler's war in the East were based in ideology and the perception of racial superiority. Nazism fundamentally opposed the Bolshevik ideology of communism and the elimination of social classes because the Nazis believed in a social and economic hierarchy based on race. Hitler believed that Jews were responsible for Bolshevism and associated them with the Bolsheviks and peoples in Eastern Europe. He believed these peoples were the enemy of Nazi Germany and should be either eliminated or subjugated to serve what he saw as the superior German Aryan race. Expanding on this racist ideology is the concept of Lebensraum, which refers to living space for the growing Nazi Germany. This was to allow the Germans to reach their goal of a vast, self-reliant empire. Beyond simply more space or more room to settle, this idea proposes expansion with the intent of acquiring the resources needed for a quote-unquote greater Germany in the future, which is the translation of the text in this picture. Here is shown what would not only be the Nazis' superior German family on the left, but the resources needed to fuel the future empire on the right. Notice that this does not just include natural resources and factories, but also labor. As previously mentioned, the Nazis aimed to subjugate peoples they deemed as inferior to fuel their economy, which is clearly depicted in this map. These motivations accumulated into the planning of Operation Barbarossa. The first concepts of an eastern attack were drafted independently by the Chief of Command of the Wehrmacht, or the German Army, Franz Halder. This was Operations Outline East and was motivated by Halder's apprehensions about the Soviets expanding further west towards Germany. The goal was to deter this by striking the Soviets first, and it outlined a general invasion plan. The more nuanced and detailed strategies were the Marx-Lossberg's plans, which incorporated the idea of multiple army groups striking into different areas of the Soviet Union. The Lossberg plan was chosen and revised multiple times, and included three main army groups attacking north towards Leningrad, east towards Moscow, and south towards Ukraine. The final draft was revised by Hitler and included a thrust toward Leningrad by the Center Army Group to help eliminate the Soviet armies in the north. Plans for Operation Barbarossa were finalized in Hitler's War Directive No. 21, which outlined the strategy and goals of the operation. Here is a general outline of the plan of attack. Important features include the north, center, and south arrows indicating respective army groups, as well as the cities of Leningrad in the north, Smolensk in the center, Kiev in the south, and ultimately Moscow in the east. The northern Dvina River and southern Dnieper River are also important reference points to note. The transparent arrows indicate long-term or secondary goals of the operation, and the Southern Army Group would be supported by forces from Romania. The army groups consisted of infantry armies and panzer groups, and were supported by the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe. The armies were comprised of infantry, cavalry, and artillery divisions, and the panzer groups were comprised of tank and motorized divisions, including trucks and motorcycles for supply and transport. Army Group Center was commanded by Field Marshal von Bock and was the strongest of the three. It included two panzer groups led by Colonel Generals Hoth and Guderian, and had the largest infantry army, the German Fourth Army. Panzer groups would lead the advance with air support from the Luftwaffe to break through enemy lines and trap Soviet forces that would be handled by the following infantry armies. Army Group South would also be supported by those forces from Romania and also from Italy. When comparing the forces of each side, the Soviet Union clearly has an apparent advantage in numbers among each category listed. However, numbers do not always equate to strength. While the Soviet Union troops initially outnumbered the Germans by nearly 2 million, these 5.5 million Soviet troops were initially spread across the vastness of the Soviet Union, while Germany's 3.3 million men were all focused at the front. In addition, the huge numbers of tanks, aircraft, and other military equipment possessed by the Soviets was as deceiving as many of them were outdated and under maintenance, rendering them ineffective. This is not to say that the Soviets did not possess very formidable and sometimes superior equipment, in particular their KV-1 and T-34 heavy tanks, but it is rather to point out that the number of these vehicles listed cannot be used to depict an accurate representation of the Soviet forces. The German army, or the Wehrmacht, had made many assumptions about the Soviet Union's Red Army. They believed that Soviet forces were greatly inferior to their own based on multiple factors. Firstly, the German perception of the Soviets' capability was based on the Russian army's poor performance in World War I, and the Nazis figured this would reflect similarly in the new war, and especially since they assumed the Soviets were still operating with their old, outdated equipment. In addition, the Red Army had recently been purged by Stalin, which eliminated or removed nearly 60% of the army, many of those being positions of leadership. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, the reorganizing of the Red Army from these purges was still happening. On top of that was the racial element of the Nazi thinking, which added to the presumption that the Soviets were inherently inferior. These factors and beliefs only added to the idea that the Nazis were greatly superior to their adversary. The strategy of the Wehrmacht was to destroy the Soviet forces completely and quickly, without allowing them to retreat or withdraw. This was to oppose the Soviet strategy of creating time and space. If the Red Army was able to retreat and build up defenses, then it could stall the war, and the Germans knew from a historical perspective that this could lead to a long, difficult fight through a Russian winter. To avoid this, the whole operation pivoted around defeating the Soviets as quickly as possible, and especially before the weather turned. They were to achieve this goal by again using the blitzkrieg method of a very fast and powerful advance of armored divisions supported by the Luftwaffe, which would encircle enemy forces and be followed by the infantry armies to pressure them to surrender. In addition to capturing enemy forces, it was also the aim of the German army to seize key resources along their path of advance. These included food, fuel depots, industrial centers, and railways, which could fortify the German supply and logistics as the operation ensued. They needed to do this because Germany was facing supply issues before the start of the operation. The war economy had stagnated, and the production of tanks, replacement parts, planes, and trucks would struggle to meet the demands of the army given their massive goals. They were running low on key resources such as rubber, oil, and food supplies, the latter of which they were importing from the Soviets. So to make up for this, they needed to take those resources as they took territory in the operation. The Germans had also allocated 3/4 of all their troops to the Eastern Front, and the remaining quarter were spread out among other fronts, meaning it would be difficult to get reserves if the need were to arise. Hitler and members of high command were aware of all of this, which is partly why timing was so important in the operation, and why they had factored in the acquisition of Soviet resources to compensate. Not only did they assume victory would be swift, but they needed it to be, so that these issues didn't continue to mount. Supply, however, was not the only problem facing the Nazis before the operation began. When some of the Army's studies indicated significant difficulties, such that supplies would only last the Germans 2 to 3 months and that the final line of advance was completely unrealistic, this kind of information would be redacted when presented to Hitler. Keeping direct information from Hitler would become a larger theme as the operation progressed. For example, in this map, there's a black arrow pointing to Moscow from Smolensk. While Moscow was an objective target in Operation Barbarossa, it would become a point of contention as the operation unfolded. From his actions taken during the invasion, Hitler might have made this arrow transparent. That is to say, to make Moscow a secondary target. But High Command and other members of the army would consider this the most important part of the whole operation. They would consider Moscow paramount, but avoid disagreeing directly with Hitler when he was focused on other targets. And instead, they would try to circumvent him by giving vague orders to certain leaders of the invasion, particularly in Army Group Center, in hopes that they would see Moscow as the best means to achieving victory. The main perpetrators of this divergence were Chief of Staff of High Command Franz Halder and the Chief Commander of the Army, Walther von Clausewitz. These two men would be most often in contact with Hitler and would be overseeing the operation under him. Why were they so fixated on Moscow, and why didn't they communicate this directly with Hitler? Well, during the invasion of France, when the Nazis secured Paris, the whole country fell with it. This influenced the focus on Moscow for Halder and Clausewitz in Operation Barbarossa. It was assumed Moscow would be the quickest way to defeat the Soviets, especially given that they deemed the Soviets were inferior to the French. In addition, when they had previously mentioned concerns of the French invasion plan to Hitler, they were heavily criticized for doing so. They wanted to avoid this happening again with Operation Barbarossa, and so instead of communicating their focus on Moscow, Halder instead made slight revisions to War Directive Number 21. in which he made the point of pursuing the Soviet capital more ambiguous and implied that Hitler was in agreement with the army's point of view. Hitler was instead more focused on securing Leningrad and Ukraine as a means of achieving operational success. He believed the Soviets could be defeated before reaching Moscow, which could happen by defeating the Red Army and capturing these key industrial and railroad centers. Securing Leningrad would also give the Germans a strong foothold in the Baltics, where many Soviet naval bases were located, as well as deal a political blow against Bolshevism. Ukraine was very rich in agricultural resources and led to the Caucasus oil fields, which were crucial resources that Germany needed. It is important to note here that while Hitler and High Command diverged in their methods of reaching victory, they converged on the same operational goals, which were destroying the Soviet armies and acquiring their land and resources for the future German Empire. This idea of destroying the Soviets, however, went further than simply conquering them for practical purposes. Hitler declared this a total war against the Soviet Union, which was very different from other wars Germany had waged previously in Europe. The idea of total war was that the Nazis would not only defeat the Red Army and Bolshevism, but rather that they sought to annihilate them altogether. This was highly motivated by the Nazis' racist belief that Jews were responsible for Bolshevism and that the two went hand in hand. Their extreme anti-Semitism manifested in directives that ordered mass executions of innocent Jews and Bolsheviks alike throughout the operation. The Barbarossa Directive decreed that occupied Soviet citizens who were uncooperative with the Nazis were to be shot without any legal recourse for the German soldiers shooting them. And the Commissar orders decreed the execution of any and all Soviet military political officers, again with no legal recourse. The main army groups were followed by killing squads from the German SS, and both were committing these atrocities throughout the operation, which would lead to major consequences for the Germans and Soviets alike. These directives were issued on the eve of the operation and set the stage for one of the most brutal invasions in history. Initially planned for May 15, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was delayed by about a month from an operation in the Balkans, and so began on June 22, 1941. It opened with German artillery strikes and the aforementioned blitzkrieg of panzer groups dominating the advance with the support from the Luftwaffe and the infantry armies. The Soviet forces were taken completely by surprise, as Stalin had failed to warn them of the impending invasion. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal von Bock, was again the strongest of the three branches, and saw very quick success in the opening stages. It was spearheaded by Panzer Groups 2, led by Heinz Guderian, and 3, led by Hermann Hoth, with Group 3 pushing the northern part of the encirclements, and 2 pushing the southern part of the encirclements. Group 2 was initially lagging behind Group 3 due to muddy roads, but altogether these two panzer groups led to the success of Army Group Center. Army Group North also made quick initial success, but the Southern Army Group met the heaviest resistance from the Soviets and made considerably slower progress compared to the North and Center Army Groups. With the Center Group's success, they quickly made their way to Minsk, which was one of the largest cities between the start of their advance and Smolensk. This was really a large area that encompassed Minsk and Bialystok, and was encircled by Panzer Groups 2 and 3 from the north and south. Hoth completed his ring of the encirclement and was waiting for Guderian in the south, who was trying to close a gap where Soviet forces were spilling east. It was completed by the end of June and led to the capture of nearly 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Hoth and Guderian wanted to quickly move to the Vina and Dnieper rivers, but this was denied by High Command, which gave the Soviets time to shore up defenses in that region. The initial overall Soviet response varied throughout the operation. Again, while Stalin had intel on the Germans preparing for the invasion, he did not inform his armies of this. There were more forces stationed in the south, which is partly why Army Group South made such slow progress. But the Soviets facing the center and north German army groups were being trapped in huge encirclements. Sometimes, these groups would surrender to the Germans en masse, and in some areas, they dug into their strongholds and fought until the last man, which was a surprise to the Germans. Other times, these encirclements were so vast that huge numbers of Soviet troops were roaming around in enemy territory unknowingly, and once discovering German supply lines, began sabotaging them with small surprise attacks. The Soviets lacked good communication systems to organize their forces, and their superior tanks, the KV-1 and T-34, were sometimes operating with no munitions and inexperienced drivers. Any earlier counteroffensives were ineffective due to organization and communication issues. Despite these favorable circumstances and Germany's tremendous initial success, the Wehrmacht was facing significant issues. The panzer groups were very quickly outpacing the German infantry armies due to the sheer size of the operation. The Soviet forces, trapped in panzer encirclements that were fighting to the death, or trying to escape east, or using guerrilla tactics to sabotage German supply lines, made the German infantry's advance even more difficult, and left the rear flank of the panzer divisions vulnerable. Even without fighting the encircled Soviet forces, the vast distances covered by the marching German army left them totally exhausted. So much so that some German soldiers died from this exhaustion, and there were recorded thoughts of suicide among others. If these situations were not difficult enough, the supply and logistical issues were being compounded by the terrain. The lack of adequate roads and their condition plagued supply vehicles, panzers, and horse-drawn artillery and carriages. Many of these roads were sandy and dusty when it was dry, and turned to mud when it rained. The dust, once kicked up by the panzers, clogged engines and resulted in a much higher consumption of oil to flush them out. Since oil was already scarce and transporting it took time, if these tanks pushed the limit, they could ruin the engines altogether, requiring replacements, which were slow to produce and even slower to transport to the front. The supply trucks were forced into long single columns, which delayed the ability to supply the widening front, and were often stuck in the mud, which exacerbated the issue and left them more vulnerable to attacks. These trucks, as well as carriages, would also become damaged from the conditions of the roads, and since the Germans had to acquire so many different models from not having enough of their own, the standardization for repairs and replacement parts was nearly non-existent. The Soviet response did not help the Germans with these mounting problems. As mentioned before, Soviet soldiers trapped behind enemy lines could sabotage the vulnerable supply trucks. In addition, Stalin announced a scorched earth policy, which encouraged Soviet soldiers and citizens to burn crops, kill livestock, and destroy bridges, roads, and rail lines before German forces could reach them. This was to prevent the Germans from acquiring these resources which they desperately needed. Factories for production would be completely disassembled before the Nazis arrived and moved further east where they would be reassembled to keep Soviet production continuous. These actions thwarted the German strategy of capturing key resources, which was vital to keeping up their invasion. In the midst of these growing challenges, the German army was undeterred from achieving their goals. It can be easy to wonder why this would be the case after examining everything that was going wrong for the Wehrmacht. But to understand their fierce optimism, it is important to look at the progress they made at this point in the operation. By the end of June, Army Group North and Center had advanced with great success, the former having already crossed the Dwina River and the latter having taken Minsk and was pushing to the Dwina River and Dnieper rivers. The supply and logistics issue, as well as other challenges previously mentioned, had not yet reached their peak, and at Minsk alone, the German forces captured nearly 300,000 Soviet soldiers, 2,500 Soviet tanks, and 1,500 guns. Since High Command was focused on destroying the Red Army and assumed them to be vastly inferior, These numbers were indicating a victory might happen sooner than expected. The next move for Army Group Center was the Smolensk area, where the Soviet forces were mounting, and the more Soviets the Germans captured or killed, the nearer they thought victory was for them. Smolensk, however, would prove more challenging for Army Group Center than any part of the invasion had been for them up until this point. The Soviet forces growing there were massive and were comprised of 3 whole armies. This enormous capability of generating new forces was not something the Wehrmacht had anticipated. Due to mandatory military service in the Soviet Union and the age limit of soldiers being increased up to 50 years old, the nation had unimaginable reserves of citizens with prior military training that could be mobilized to fight in the army. In addition to the new armies, the Soviet Air Force and artillery were now proving to be very formidable to the Germans. This did not favor Army Group Center, and neither did their overextension. Due to the supply and logistics, some panzer divisions at Smolensk were operating between 30 and 50% strength, were running low on munitions, and were waiting on infantry to arrive, who were met with fire from the Soviet planes and artillery. Commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, acknowledged this struggle as the Soviet resistance mounted and High Command diverted forces to other divisions that were initially intended for him. This is noted in his war diary from passages saying, "The pocket at Smolensk still not done. Very regrettable, for the enemy's attacks on the Eastern Front are growing even stronger." And, "I have almost no reserves left to meet the enemy massing of forces and the constant counterattacks. They took away my offensive air power and heavy artillery and diverted some of the reserves originally destined for my front, the painful consequences of which are beginning to show. With the present state of the railroads, I can't receive any help from home or through the shifting of forces." All the while, Halder at high command is eager to finish this battle and continue to Moscow. Even with these sentiments from Bach and the mounting obstacles, Army Group Center succeeded in its encirclement of Smolensk with the support of their 3rd and 2nd Panzer Groups. Once capturing the city and surrounding the area, the German forces were exhausted to their limits, and Bach knew that they needed respite. Some in high command were becoming concerned, but Halder was eager to drive to Moscow. Hitler, however, had been getting anxious about other objectives. While Army Group Center was completing the Smolensk encirclement in early August, Hitler issued Directive 33 due to his anxieties from the slow progress of Army Group South in Ukraine and Army Group North struggling to secure the area around Leningrad. It stated that Army Group Center would divert forces to these areas to help secure the objectives there, as well as put a focus on smaller encirclement tactics, which were wildly unpopular among the Wehrmacht. High Command, who are realizing the struggle at Smolensk, finally communicated to Hitler their focus on the drive for Moscow, and that this new directive would slow the operation, which must be avoided at all costs. Hitler revised Directive 33 to Directive 33A, which still diverted Army Group Center to Leningrad and Ukraine, but gave some concessions to High Command. Hitler stated that Moscow could be sued by the infantry armies at Smolensk, but High Command knew this couldn't happen without support of the diverted panzer groups. This was all happening before Smolensk was even captured, and once it was, Army Group Center needed time to rest and refit their forces. This map shows the progress of Operation Barbarossa up to late August 1941. Note the blue, far-right dotted circle in the middle of the German Eastern Front. This is Smolensk, and behind it to the southwest is the encircled Minsk area. The red dotted lines indicate the paths of the German forces among each army group. This is for visual reference and to indicate the vastness of Operation Barbarossa, as well as show the situations in the north and south. Here we see that neither Leningrad nor Kiev are yet surrounded, and at this juncture, Army Group Center would send panzer groups to these areas to help secure them. By the start of September, these objectives were still not captured, but with the help from Army Group Center's panzer groups, the situations there were becoming favorable. German forces were beginning to gain control of the area around Leningrad, where the siege of the city would soon begin, and the encirclement of Kiev, which had been ongoing, was now gaining more momentum. Near the end of the month, these areas were more secure, and Army Groups North and South would make forces available to Army Group Center for their decisive push east from Smolensk to crush the remaining Soviet forces there. Now, Hitler's goals in the north and south were being reached. He and High Command were optimistic about a nearing victory east of Smolensk, and Army Group Center had their time to rest and refit and were now fortified and ready to make their advance. This phase was termed Operation Typhoon and began on October 2, 1941. The objective was to defeat the remainder of the Red Army in the east from where the Wehrmacht could make its desired push to Moscow. It started with 1,500 tanks, comprising reinforced panzer groups followed by infantry armies, and within 5 days they had succeeded in one of the largest encirclements in the operation around the Vyazma and Bryansk area. They captured enormous numbers of Soviet prisoners and were feeling like victory was only days away. High Command and Hitler also shared this sentiment and believed that the Soviet reinforcements must be nearly defeated after all the soldiers killed, captured, or wounded by this point in the war. In fact, they were so optimistic that the Nazi press announced victory preemptively. Little did the Germans know that soon their fortunes would take a significant turn for the worse. Only 2 days after the success at Vyazma and Bryansk, the Rasputitsa, or roadless season, began. Rains turned roads to mud and completely stalled out whole panzer divisions. Supply issues had already reached criticality, and some tank divisions had run out of fuel even before this point. Supply trucks were now stuck dead in the mud and made the situation even more acute. The divisions that could move did so at a terribly slow pace and were now dealing not only with the terrain, but with fortified Soviet defenses along the main roads. By the end of the month, Bach decided to halt the 4th and 9th Armies as well as the 2nd Panzer Army because they were out of supplies. In addition, he needed time to resupply. He also needed time to wait for the ground to freeze so that other forces could gain traction. Army Group Center, with the strongest forces of the 4th Army and the 4th Panzer Group, were now only about 90 kilometers from Moscow. In mid-November, the weather allowed for the continuation of the stalled German forces where they encountered heavy Soviet resistance along the way to Moscow. They reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital by the end of the month, where Army Group Center had few divisions left. Temperatures were dropping to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and German soldiers had not prepared to fight under these circumstances. With freezing conditions, depleted forces, and little supplies left, the German forces there were in a dire situation. They had overextended themselves while also pushing the enemy back to one of its strongest logistical assets, which was being fortified since July. On December 5th, the Soviet armies launched counteroffensives from Moscow and began breaking through German lines in the surrounding area, which forced the first German retreats of the invasion. This marked the end of the offensive Operation Barbarossa and put the Nazis in a position of defensive warfare in the east. Here we see the most progress that was achieved during the operation and just how close Army Group Center came to reaching the fateful Soviet capital. The factors that led to the failure of Operation Barbarossa can be summed up into 3 categories. The first being the divergent strategies between Hitler and his army. The next being their complete logistical failure, and lastly, their total underestimation of their enemy. The logistical issues could be seen as part of the underestimation, but there are some distinctions between these 2 points. The divergence in ideas of how to achieve success hindered the operation from the start. As stated earlier, because High Command was wary of disagreeing with Hitler or telling him things they think he didn't want to hear, their motives manifested in ambiguous directions for the Army. This led to disagreements within Army Group Center, which sometimes held up the advance. Furthermore, if Hitler and the Army were unified in their approach, they may not have lost the time stalling out after Smolensk, which gave the Soviet forces time to build defenses and produce equipment. This is not to say that it would have guaranteed success, but rather that it could have saved time and resources, which were both paramount in the operation. The supply and logistics issues were simply beyond detrimental. As mentioned before, the deplorable roads plagued logistics, and the lack of intel on this matter was a complete failure. Another issue, not previously mentioned, was that the Germans planned to capture Soviet railways, which were a different rail gauge or width than the German locomotives. This meant that the Germans had to convert kilometers of railways as they went and build new service stations along the way, which cost them time they didn't have. These trains would often take hours at a time, leaving supply truck lines waiting for new arrivals. The lack of German trucks and carriages needed to supply the troops necessitated acquiring more of these from France or other areas, leading to little standardization for repair or replacement parts, which also stalled the supply lines even further. These were all things working against their logistical capabilities and could have been more properly planned for in an operation in which timing was so crucial. But this ultimately leads to the Nazis' greatest obstacle. Hitler and his armies underestimated the Soviet forces equally as much as they overestimated their own capabilities. This was partly a result of their twisted views of being racially superior to the Soviets. Their confidence was also informed by their previous successes in Western Europe before Operation Barbarossa. And together, these led to the assumption that the Soviet forces would not be able to put up a stronger fight than the French or others whom they had already conquered. In addition, the Germans failed to consider the massive number of forces the Soviets were able to generate, as well as the possibility of superior Soviet technology. They discovered the likes of the Soviet KV-1 and T-34 tanks, which were vastly superior to the Germans' panzers and impervious to their anti-tank guns. They also assumed that they would be welcomed by the local populations as heroes and didn't think that the Nazis' war of annihilation would galvanize these peoples into partisan warfare against them. Again, they failed to plan accordingly for such a tremendous operation, but were entirely confident in their success. It is only natural to ask why the Germans would be so confident, even throughout the operation, when these issues mounted and mounted. One explanation would be that they achieved enormous military feats throughout this operation. The number of Soviet forces captured was staggering. In Minsk, it was nearly 300,000. Smolensk, 200,000. Kiev and Vyazma, both 660,000 troops captured. These don't include the total prisoners taken between June and December or the number of Soviets killed or wounded. Without being aware of the Soviets' force generation capability or war production, it is fairly reasonable to understand why the Nazis were undeterred by their challenges. Each move further east could seem like it was going to crush the Red Army altogether. Another explanation, given by Dr. David Stale in his 2015 video lecture on Operation Barbarossa, is what he terms nationalist socialist military thinking. Stale attributes Hitler achieving his rise to power through his quote-unquote supremacy of will. That through focus and will, Hitler believed anything could be accomplished. And this mentality was adopted by his regime. Through the power of will alone, the Nazis believed they could realize any of their goals, even if they seemed completely irrational to others. However, this way of thinking, along with their twisted racial beliefs, led to more than just military irrationality. Together, these would lead to dire consequences throughout the Nazis' war of annihilation. As already mentioned, for the Germans, this war was meant to wipe out the Soviets and their Bolshevik ideologies altogether. This manifested in major atrocities against innocent civilians and captured Soviet soldiers alike. There was an estimated 3.3 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner throughout Operation Barbarossa, and nearly two-thirds of these prisoners would be dead by the spring of 1942. The prison camps were sometimes nothing more than large fields lined with barbed wire fence where Soviet prisoners were left to starve or die of disease. Other times, prisoners were sent to labor camps where their fate would not be much better. Countless Soviet citizens, and particularly Jews that were occupied by the Nazis, were victims of the Wehrmacht and SS alike throughout Operation Barbarossa. Killing squads followed the army groups committing mass murders of hundreds to thousands of people at a time. By 1942, nearly 200,000 Jews were killed in Belarus alone. And there were instances of using people as minesweepers, where Germans led them through minefields to clear the area for soldiers, or using dynamite or exhaust gas to kill civilians. The sheer number of people being killed under the Barbarossa and Commissar directives during Operation Barbarossa ultimately informed the future of the ongoing Holocaust by leading the Nazis to believe that they needed what they saw as more efficient ways to kill large quantities of people at a time. In all, Operation Barbarossa opened the largest land war between two nations in the history of the world. It cost a staggering number of lives between each side and among innocent civilians, and ultimately, it showed the world the greatest weaknesses of Nazi Germany as well as the capability of the Soviet Union. It was the Nazis' first military defeat and began their defeat in the war in the East, and ultimately, their defeat in World War II. The first source listed here was used as a general outline for the operation and gave details on the chronology of the Army Group's movements. The next two sources detailed the ideological aspect of Operation Barbarossa and details on the atrocities against the Soviet citizens and Jews in the Eastern Front. The fourth source was used for information on the precursors to the planning of Operation Barbarossa. And lastly on this page is the source which was again used to confirm the general movements of the German forces throughout the operation. The first two sources here were used to get a general overview of the topic, some specific numbers on troops, equipment, and prisoners, as well as expert insights on Operation Barbarossa by Dr. David Stale. The third is Dr. David Stale's book on Operation Barbarossa, which was the main source used for this project. It included tremendous details of precursors, planning, directives, movement of forces, numbers of German troops and equipment, and details on communications between Hitler and his high command. Lastly, this source focused solely on Operation Typhoon and gave general outlines and figures for the final part of Operation Barbarossa.